Hello adventurers and welcome back to my channel. Today we are in Forks, Washington, and we're going to check out the Forks Timber Museum. Now this is going to be a great one because it's right here next to the visitor center and it's got a really inexpensive admission and a big history to tell us a little bit more about this area that is so cool. So let's go inside. Now this is actually pretty cool because it tells you what is also outside. There's a fire lookout tower, there's a cedar tree house, a giant 15-foot crawl-through log, a welcome sign. Of course, there is Burl and Crosscut, the two 7-foot tall loggers. And then also something here that I'm going to be showing you on an upcoming episode. These are replicas of Bella's trucks from the Twilight series. Also, before we move inside, this was kind of cool. This is actually the Timber Museum that we're standing in. It was built by the Forks High School carpentry class between the years of 1989 and 1990. Over 100 individuals helped them out. There were organizations and businesses contributing their time, money, and materials, and this is the group that did it. Talk about some talented kids, right? I think that that just goes to show the talent of this community and also what this means to the community. And so now as we move inside, we can learn a little bit more. Okay, cost of admission is only $3, and now we are inside and we can look at all of the different things. Now, a few things that I want to note is that for all the displays that we're seeing, there are little descriptions right here. So, of course, I will be showing you some of the highlights, but you guys have to come here to see all of the other things. I think that you're gonna love it because again, you get to learn a lot about the area and the industry, and it's going to be really great. Now there are two sides here, and then we can go upstairs and then go around that fire tower, which is going to be super fun. And then also there's a few other things outside that I'm going to show you. But without further ado, let's get to seeing some of these cool things. I think this is a good place to start. This is actually a 1923 cookhouse stove, and this stove served the crews who built the dam in this area along the river. It also served the loggers who worked nearby in the woods, and this is a huge cooktop, but I really like how they have illustrated how it would be used by adding all of these different items here. So you could kind of get a feel for what this would have looked like when it was in action. Now there's a few other things here, which is kind of interesting. This was considered a 3-oven Lang hotel range, and so you can see the initial listing right here. It was put together by Lang Manufacturing Company out of Seattle, and you can see below each one of those 3 ovens. Now, I love these little displays because they give you the historic photos, but they also give you a challenge. It says, can you split this log to a smaller size? Yes, I can't. So it shows you here how that they are using these tools to put a wedge in between these massive logs and then to kind of push down in there and to pop the logs open. Now it says the Pacific View is one of the hardest hardwood trees in the Pacific Northwest. So that's kind of interesting. Kind of working our way back to the cookhouse a bit more though. The cookhouse was the most important building in the camp, and also it served so many people. It says that they could stow away between 6,000 and 9,000 calories a day in the form of meat, potatoes, gravy, vegetables, fruit, and veggies, and meals were served at 6 a.m. and 5 p.m. So what about lunch? Well, they were actually out in the middle of the forest at that time, so they took a boxed lunch with them, and that's where they ate. Their hours were dictated by when they could be working, so they wanted to capitalize and make the most of that time, so they would just take it with them. Now, whenever they were being served at these cook stations, they actually had women who would serve them and take care of everything at the tables, and that was kind of their duties around the camp. This little piece right here though blew my mind. One day, 100-man crew, 150 pounds of fresh meat, 50 pounds of smoked meat, 200 pounds of fruits and veggies, mostly potatoes, 150 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of sugar, 25 pounds of butter, 25 dozen eggs, and enough coffee, tea, and milk to wash it all down. That was every single day. So now we learned about how the loggers would eat, but let's learn about how they would do their jobs. We saw that little placard about splitting the logs, but there are a lot more pieces to this puzzle that move to make it work. And that's what the rest of the museum is going to kind of focus on as we kind of move around, seeing some of those things. And there's one right literally in front of me that is very daunting. More historic photos here are showing the Forks Shingle Mill, and that was in about 1956 that you're seeing this photo. Workers inside of the mill would use these massive cut-off saws. Do you see how big this thing is? Well, that was just one of the tools of the trade. This was an 84-inch cut-off saw. But also in this corner, do you recognize any of these tools of the trade? Some of these look pretty familiar. There are things that are very similar to the chainsaws that we might use for doing landscaping and things like that, but they're on a much more aggressive looking scale, and they're quite large. You can see in this post alone several different variations of chainsaws, and then this guy up here is huge. In fact, these kind of saws were used predominantly in the woods as they went through and did this job. And in 1920, they had something called the drag saw, which was introduced. This drag saw was a little bit different because it could run by steam or by gas. They also had things called two-man power saws. Those two-man power saws were just that. They would require two people in order to operate them to keep them safely maneuvering and cutting the medium, so to speak. So those were kind of big though. It says on this sign right over here, in fact, that they could weigh up to 105 pounds. This photo right here is actually taken at one of the bunkhouses as we move into the bunkhouse exhibit. And in front of me, there is a makeshift bunkhouse recreation that would show you kind of what it would have looked like. It's a little darker in here. The lights are flickering. It's kind of cramped and congested, but this is what they would have had in order to keep all of their things while they were working at one of the camps. And you see here, there is a nice way to keep warm. They have their clothes kind of hung up, all of the things that they need to have access to. They have a few extra pieces of equipment in here. Some of the shoes that have spikes on them are down here. You have a couple of little foot lockers to store tools. The beds themselves, very thin, but at the same time effective. And then also they have a little table where they could either eat or work on things. And as we look at this photo, it says that actually a logger's home a lot of times was built on skids so that they could be moved from place to place. Their bedding varied from a metal bunk to a straw bunk floor, and some logging camps the men had to actually bring their own bedrolls. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Final Destination, but if you have, coming to this area, there are a lot of logging trucks, but some of these have some considerably larger pieces. Look at this. This is one massive piece, and so is this one right here. So the trucks that we're seeing today are carrying a lot of different pieces. These are just huge. Now, logging throughout the years has changed a lot, from more hands-on to now they're using more heavy equipment. However, here you see the entirety of the process of kind of moving into that, and then also some of the massive trees that once were. And you can see now why some of these trees are protected, because they were just so big and so mammoth and such a part, and now many of them are gone. But here we learn a little bit more about all of that, and also look, this is interesting. This is sharing a little bit of the Washington history of this area. In fact, as you go through this entire corner, not only do you have the historic photos, which have been so well preserved and redone, but also some murals to describe kind of what it would have been like at the time of the logging. In addition, there are a few more of the logging tools and things that they would have used at that time. And then here is where it gets very interesting, because here we move into what's called the Steam Era. And you can see how the Steam Era would have played out through this small depiction right here. But below, you can also find some of the Steam Era pieces that have been kind of on a miniature here, and it's quite fascinating to see how these things would have helped out. In fact, as we get a little bit closer, steam-powered high-lead logging operation, duplex, loading, mounting on a railroad car. This was known as the unit, as both yarding and loading machine. So this is what was going on in this picture right here. And the further we get in there, it's more and more fascinating because you see the different pieces that they would have used coming into play as they're showing how they would have worked in the bigger picture as a whole. Now let's talk trees. If you are out in the forest, a lot of times the average person doesn't have the biggest understanding of all the different kinds of trees that might be around them. So here they have a display so you can kind of see what the bark looks like and what the interior looks like. So maybe it can come in handy for you guys and me also in finding out what kind of trees that we're surrounded by. You know, you can always determine by the leaves also, but sometimes, especially on the super tall trees, you might not be able to see those leaves like up close. So this is helpful. It's here that they give a brief description of several of these and also show you what is native to this area, such as the western red cedar or the western hemlock here. You also have the Douglas fir and the Sitka spruce. There's also the broadleaf maple and then the Pacific silver fir also. But what I like about this the most is when we get down to the bark itself, you can see the variations in the bark. And I think that that's the thing that resonates with most of us when we're out in the forest. We definitely can see the bark. So this is helpful, definitely. Now, when logging first started, it actually wasn't on the scale that we think of it today. A lot of times, the initial logging in the earliest of settlers actually started by people just wanting to clear a little patch of land so they could farm it or place their home there. But then it turned into an industry as it was fueling out and transportation became more widely available. And people were needing wood because, well, progress. But unfortunately, in doing so, there were a lot of things that kind of got overlooked along the way. And so it was important to find that balance, like we talked about before. This is one of the trees. Look at this. This is a man, and this is a man. And the men are only about the size of my hand tall. So the size of my hand. And then this tree, just in this one section, is several men tall, and you can tell this is just like the bottom of the tree. So at one point, these trees were the ones that they were also going with because they could do a lot with one of these trees. But then they started cutting down more and more and more. And that's whenever some changes had to be made. It's a little bit harder to see, but I definitely encourage you to come and check out this particular triptych right here. It shows 1984, 2001, and 2019. It talks about how in the 60s and 70s, the Washington State Department of Natural Resources actually made timber sales over much of the western peninsula, which is the area that we're in currently. By seeing these, you can see that in 2019, because of the restrictions that they put in some of the areas, that the population of trees is actually replenishing, but they still are doing something called clear cutting, which looks like this. Now, I've driven past many places where it has looked like this, and it looks really sad because it's surrounded by all the forest around. But there's actually a reason why they do this as opposed to some of the other things that they could do. Now, by doing this, it takes a while for them to clear out the section, and there's a few explainers as to why right here. But a few things that I did not know. Number one, whenever you go and you see an area that has been clear cut, the reason why they've done that is because it's more efficient to do that in an area for the logging process. Number two, whenever you see those big piles of downed trees, a lot of times that is a result of them doing what they call eco stacks. The eco stacks are kind of where they push all of this debris together, and it gives the new seedlings the best opportunity to possibly pop up from the existing trees that were already in the area. Number three, you see some big stumps out there. Those are not going anywhere. In fact, because most of those stumps belong to a tree that might be 200 feet tall, it's deep into the ground. And so removing those would be extremely difficult. And number four, why did they not just clear cut and then clear it and then replant new trees? Well, a lot of times they like to replant trees seasonally so that they have the best chance at getting out and growing again. But timber companies in this area have been doing this for quite some time, and that's what's helped to replenish the forests around us as they take down only what is necessary now. Now, while you're visiting also, you'll want to check out this. This is a historic walking tour, and you can find out some really great information here. Like, for example, they actually had a Forks fire in 1925, and this is what it looked like. You can use the guide to locate other stations, but this is one of the biggest historical fires in this area. This is another one that's kind of interesting. It connects you to the settlers and Forks, and it tells you a little bit more about the pack trains that actually supplied the goods throughout the Forks area. And you can see, again, another historic photo. I love whenever we have these because it really puts things into perspective of the difference in time. You can see things in modern days, but when you see them how they once were, it really shows you how much growth that a community has had. And speaking of historic photos, if you have the opportunity to come here, oh yeah, this is like a mecca for just seeing all of these amazing things from the past. Some of these really cool photos. In fact, this one right here, can you see this? This is a truck up in the air because the tree behind it is clearly too big. But then here's another one of the massive trees, and look, these are 160 feet long. These are wonderful photos, but it's not just the logging industry that is represented here. There were other things also which are kind of fascinating, and you really get a sense for some of the things that were around. Now, outside, there was actually a building that is made out of a stump, and I thought that was kind of fascinating. I'm going to show you that when we go outside. But here, you actually see that they created stump houses, and here's another stump house up here. That's so cool. I don't think I've ever seen that in any other place. So it's really fascinating to see these historic photos, and those were from like the earliest of 1900s. Then here you have a picture of like the school and the children. So many cool things. A lot of times we take for granted the infrastructure pieces like this right here. It was actually a bridge put out by the Hoh River. And here is like when they first dedicated that bridge. It was all the way back in 1931. In comparison, this is a log-based bridge that looks absolutely terrifying, and I would be so scared of this one. Now, much like any other community that we have visited, they have to have something other than just one industry, because not everybody can be involved in one thing. And so you had to have ways for certain other things to happen also. And so here we enter into the farming on the West End display, and you can see some farm equipment and things like that that might have been used at that time. I'm going to show you around just a little bit, let you see some of the highlights, and then we'll talk a little bit. Did you know that in this area, they actually were known for cranberries also? In fact, at the mid-30s, you can see some of these photos right here of the cranberry crops. And that last piece of machinery was actually used in separating the cranberries. Now, this was the official label that they used at that time. It was the Tips Prairie Cranberries. And it's pretty neat to see that. And then also this display, which has a little bit more information about how that process worked. Now let's talk about life at home. You can see some of the things that might have been used in the common home in this display right here. Everything from the traditional stove with the cast iron to some of the different products that might have been available at that time, kind of lining the shelves here. And then here we have a washing machine from 1908. Now, the washing machines at the time were very different than the ones we have. They were using manpower to get things done. And so this would have been quite the process, but at the same time, a super convenient way to wash clothes as opposed to using the regular traditional washboard down here. There are a couple of traditional dolls here, and then this, a small carriage that you would have been able to push your child around in, but also that has a little bit of a sun coverage area right here. Telephones were very different back then. In fact, this is what the telephone would have looked like, and if you were fortunate enough to have one of these, you couldn't just dial up a friend. You'd have to talk to an operator in order to get connected, and then other people could actually hear your conversation. This is a desk with a traditional small typewriter here. The modern day computer is a predecessor of this guy, believe it or not. We are now entering into Art's Place, and this is the tavern that was recreated here for us to be able to see what a tavern would have been like. Here we have something called a punch board, and it says that these were commonly used between the 40s and the 50s, usually in taverns and bars, but some stores actually had them too. Now, Art's Place is not a fictitious place, it's a real place here in Forks, so it's not just a facade created for us to come in and get the experience. In fact, a couple owned this from the 50s to the 70s, and they're featured on this wall over here, but there was an originator who created Art's just a short time after Prohibition, and it was one of the most well-trusted and long-standing taverns in all of Forks, and so that's why it is being celebrated here. This is cool. This is like a tabletop, I think, and it has all of these carved names, and it's just really fascinating to see up close. It doesn't translate as well on camera because it's kind of in a darker place, as taverns are, but let me show you a couple other things. At one point in time, whenever you entered into Forks, you could see this. Glad you came. Around 1917. This is a very different looking Forks than it is today, though, for sure. What do you think these are? What about this? Well, believe it or not, these are called conchs, and there is a little information here about them. These are actually shelf fungi, and they are members of the fungus kingdom, but you can find them on trees. And a lot of times, the loggers would find these, and sometimes they would turn into something different, like right here. Artists sometimes use these as a medium so that they can do scrolling and engraving. Very fascinating. Now, as we came in today, we signed in the sign-in section, but the table itself was something that I wanted to feature because this is beautiful. This is actually a block of Western red cedar, and it is gorgeous, as you can see. But on top of the table, you have a couple of other tree cookies where you can see a Pacific view right there also. Just for a kind of size comparison, though, look at that. Wow. Around the museum, you'll find very special people like this man right here. This is known as the Iron Man of the Hoe, and he actually was born in 1866, lived till 1946, and he homesteaded 30 miles up the Hoe River Valley and 17 miles south of Forks. He did ranching and farming, and this is him right here. His homesteading in the wettest land in the continental United States with 12 feet or more of rain was exceptionally difficult and actually considered extremely dangerous. Now, where there's a will, there's a way, and John found that. He wanted to find a way to make do for his family, and at times he would take on the work of 2 men in order to get things done so that he could, in fact, make the money that he needed for the supplies that he needed around his own homestead and for his family. So I thought that was just a fascinating story. But at that, we're now about to move upstairs. And oh my goodness, I'm glad we are, because whatever this is looks awesome. In fact, as we get on the level of this, it looks even more awesome. You can see the texture in it. Now, we can't touch, but at the same time, we can look. This is considered to be a logger's discover canoe. According to the provided information, this right here was discovered in 1987 when 2 timber cutters were actually working near a river, and they discovered an unfinished 28-foot canoe lying on its side, and it was partially buried at the time. Now, the side that was face up had worn pretty smooth, and at first they didn't know what it was, and as they kind of continued to uncover it, and I'll show you some of those historic photos in just a moment, they started to realize this was a big find. It has now been assumed that this is between 200 and 300 years old. What? I knew this was cool when I saw it from below, but look, it is so big. It just keeps going and going. Let's look at the photos. This is the actual story of whenever the historic canoe came to the Forks Timber Museum, and this was from 1989. It says here that the two residents are seen here hoisting and supervising to make sure that it is safe near the location in which they found it. And these were the discovery photos of what it looked like when they first initially found this. That would be a wild find. This canoe has probably seen some very interesting things. Now, what I mean by interesting is, can you imagine the stories of it just being there, not even being used, just all the things in the forest? If this thing could talk and tell you stories, it would be wild. But since it cannot, the museum has to tell the story for it by putting it here on display. But I don't mind, because I am so happy to see this piece of history. As we have moved upstairs, now there's a whole bunch of interesting things, and the first one I think is this. It looks like a little movie screen, but Elvis? This is in fact the Olympic Theater in 1937. So all of the items that we're seeing here are actually historic pieces from that particular theater. Here we find some of the original seats, and again, this Elvis right here. There is a clock from the original theater, and then also there is a very interesting blueprint of the overall Forks, Washington area. Here you find some of the playbills from the 80s and 70s, and even some of the 60s scattered in here. Right next to the theater, you find the Scouts Honors, and there are Boy Scout Assembly after Boy Scout Assembly featured here. But in this section also, a brief history of the Boy Scouts of this area, some of the patches that they had, some of the books, some of the interesting awards, a knot tying card, and no Boy Scout could be complete without his uniform. So here in Forks, they have one of the Forks Boy Scout uniforms. Now there are several different historic pieces in this section upstairs before we head outside, but I just want to touch on a couple of them, and I think that we're going to start in this display case. This is the Olympic Hot Spring between 1907 and 1966. This was considered a nature resort, and now it is considered to be gone all too soon. At the time of its heyday, it had a lobby with a massive fire that would welcome guests. You could have a variety of different activities that would start out in the lodge. And as you see up here, the first Port Angeles swim team actually came to the hot spring in 1926. I personally love a good hot spring, so when I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, let's do this. And then I realized it was closed, which is kind of sad, but that's kind of the case. But there are a lot of hot springs in the Washington and Oregon area, and they actually have a few hot spring books that I encourage you guys to check out if you're interested in hot springs. I know that I am. We are now moving outside to check out the fire tower. Now, I have a special interest in fire towers as of late. I like TikTok, and a lot of times I'll find myself scrolling. Well, I've noticed that there are a few people who attend to fire towers kind of out in the wild, and have been very fascinated by their posts because they talk about life in the fire tower. So being able to see one up close and personal and see what all is actually in there and see if it would be something that would be fathomable for me is kind of fascinating. And I'm telling you, from looking inside this, oh my gosh, yes, it would. So as you can see, we walk out onto the fire tower platform, and then here it is. It is a nice square building with windows all around. Inside, you'll see the area fire plan and some notes, some radio codes, some things that you would have to do if you were inside this to let people know there is in fact a fire. There's also an activity log. And from what I have learned from TikTok, from the guys who have been in the fire towers, they basically have to make a report every day of what is going on in the area using a variety of different codes and record that. And if there is a lightning strike or there is a fire that has gotten out of hand, they're the first ones usually to see it because they are above the tree line. Here you also find some different items that are located in the fire tower to make your job a little bit easier. And as you can see, it kind of just keeps going on and on. This is beautiful up here. Now I will say this, there are a couple of things. If you are a person who works in a fire tower and you are positioned where you are constantly there, you cannot close your windows. It doesn't work that way. You have to be able to see at any given time. So yeah, you live in a glass bubble, so to speak, but you're also way up high so that nobody really sees you. So it is what it is. A lot of times the toilets for these are actually located down low because they can't put them in the tower. In fact, here's what the bed would look like. It looks like it's a standard twin. They do have a little book tucked in though, so that's kind of fun. It's a little nod to the Twilight. And again, open windows all the way around. Now, space for walking around is pretty limited. It's about 2 to 3 feet across, but that's plenty to just kind of maneuver. Outside in the front, you do have a vent so that you can have a real stove. It looks kind of like an apartment-sized one, but it's still a real stove just the same. And again, you can see some of the things that are inside. Now, I'm not sure how the schedules work currently for those who dwell in fire towers, but at the time of the timber industry's boom here in Forks, people were living in one of these between 3 and 6 months out of the year. And they were the first line of defense for the timber industry to make sure that they were safe in case of a fire breaking out in the midst of where that they were working. And so I can see the value of this position, so much so, especially related to the Forks Timber Museum. Okay, now that we are finished up inside and at the fire tower, let's go look around just a little bit more. There are a couple of other things that I want to show you before we hit the road off to our next adventure. These are cool. You're gonna like them. Inside we saw all of those big trees. Well, look at this one. This one's huge. And just to kind of give you a comparison, look at that. Look how big that tree is. This car could literally park inside the tree, but this is actually a crawl through tree. So let's go look through the hole. Are you ready for this? Ooh. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I could literally crawl through this entire thing. It's just a little tall. In fact, the opening is above my hip, so I don't think we're jumping into that one, but yeah, I could totally fit in there, and I didn't think so because, well guys, I am a curvy queen, and I thought that that was gonna be far too compact, but I could fit in there. I could fit in there. Now this next one is one of those little houses. Look! Isn't that cool? It's a stump house, and we saw how those were used in some of those historic photos. But this one you can actually come into and actually get a feel for the space, which is not very big, but at the same time, it is noticeably cooler inside here, even just walking in, than it was standing outside. This is super well insulated because it is solid. Wow, this is cool. And on the ceiling, this is kind of interesting. There is light coming in, so I'm sure that they would put things in that, but wow, this is neat. Okay guys, that's gonna do it for us here at the Forks Timber Museum. I have thoroughly enjoyed all the new brain wrinkles, and I hope you guys have too. This is a wonderful way to find out a little bit more about the area that you're visiting, and I highly recommend it. The price is right, the information is great, and overall it just makes the experience here in Forks a little bit better. Remember guys, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time, and today was definitely that with the Forks Timber Museum. Till next time guys, bye!